Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Medeva Ghee. I am the Executive Director of the Leadership Alliance and an Associate Professor of the Practice of Behavioral and Social Sciences at Brown University. And it is my privilege to welcome you to a conversation with a doctoral scholar. In these conversations, we feature alumni who are fulfilling the mission of the Leadership Alliance as leaders and role models diversifying the research workforce. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Program, a new initiative that Leadership Alliance partners created to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate programs for students from across the country. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank my team and colleagues at Brown University, Chaminade University in Honolulu, Weill Cornell Medical College, and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine for their efforts in creating this new program. While our planning efforts have been laser focused on supporting students' academic and professional development, our plans pivoted to respond to the recent killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor that have resulted in a unifying global outcry: Black Lives Matter. Even in the midst of this rallying cry, systemic issues of police brutality and anti-Black racism persist, prompting us to add Rayshard Brooks, Robert Fuller, and Malcolm Hirsch to a long list of victims of oppressive and racist systems that continue to plague our country. To honor the memory of the lives that those systems cut short, please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. We have the responsibility and an opportunity to turn pain into purpose and understand how we have frank conversations about race in America. We consider it our privilege to have this opportunity to share this conversation with you and to work together to process the violence and injustice we have borne witness to in order to imagine and create opportunities for change. With us as a thought partner in these conversations is Dr. Robert J. Patterson, a professor of African American Studies who served as the inaugural chair of the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University from 2016 to 2019. Dr. Patterson is the author of Destructive Desires, Rhythm and Blues Culture and the Politics of Racial Equality, Exodus Politics, Civil Rights and Leadership in African American Literature and Culture, and co-editor of The Psychic Hold of Slavery, Legacies in American Expressive Culture, and editor of the Black Cultural Production After Civil Rights. And currently, he is working on a book titled Black Equity, Black Equality, Reparation, and Black Communities. Dr. Patterson has also published articles on W.E.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, African American women's writing in the 19th and 20th centuries, civil rights, Tyler Perry's films, slavery's legacies, the film 12 Years a Slave, and rhythm and blues, music and culture. His teaching interest and courses mirror his research projects, and he has taught a range of courses that examine Black cultural production, racial politics, and the legacies of slavery. Dr. Patterson has worked with governmental agencies, school systems, and other organizations to develop solutions that increase diversity, cultivate inclusion, and provide equity of access and outcomes. He has collaborated with the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving to endow the Robert J. Patterson Scholarship Fund, which supports residents of Hartford, Connecticut, who intend to pursue an undergraduate degree in African American Studies, social justice, the arts, or the humanities. Dr. Patterson participated in the Leadership Alliance Summer Research Early Identification Program in 2001 at Stanford University and completed his PhD in African American Literature and Culture at Emory University. We are so excited, so happy to have Dr. Patterson join us and help us lead this very important conversation. His presentation is entitled Race and Racism in America, Paths Forward. We look forward to hearing from Dr. Patterson. We have questions that have been submitted in advance, and we will also, as time permits, take questions in the Q&A. Dr. Patterson.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Ghee, for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about these pressing and important matters. Additionally, I want to say thank you for all of your leadership at the Leadership Alliance and for the initiatives that you have created and led and worked collaboratively with, and also for changing the format of the Leadership Alliance this year so that students could develop the important research skills necessary to advance graduate education and also to diversify the professoriate in many ways too. So thank you, and thank you again. So to all of the participants, I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight. That's precisely what I hope that we'll end up having by way of the overview that I'll address several issues perhaps for the first part. I won't identify an exact number of minutes, but and then we'll take some of the questions that have been submitted and some of the questions that will emerge from the conversation. Some of the questions that have been submitted already, I will probably begin to at least address them, and perhaps during the Q&A we'll address them, in more depth. Certainly, police accountability is one of the issues that we'll take up in the presentation too. So let me give you a little bit of context that I think might be helpful for framing the discussion that we're going to have today. So I teach two courses at Georgetown: Race and Racism in American Culture and Race and Racism in the Criminal Justice in quotation mark system. And whereas the first course, Race and Racism in American Culture, is more of a lower level introductory course, the Race and Racism in the Criminal Justice System is an upper division course that builds on some of the blocks we established in the first course, but it particularly takes a keen look at the justice system. And it puts the justice system in the context of housing, educational opportunities, and issues of this sort. And I think that is very important for reasons that hopefully will emerge in the conversation. So that is a context to provide to you to situate what I've been thinking about, how long I've been thinking about it, and why it matters. So I first taught the course on race and racism in 2015. And I have to tell you that when I taught it in 2015 and 2016, the students were engaged, and I had, a demographic that was predominantly students of color and Black students in particular. But then in the fall of 2017, when I taught it, those dynamics shift. And so you might wonder, well, what happened between fall of 2016 and fall of 2017? And I'll just say it's the thing that I hope doesn't happen on November 3rd, but we'll get back to that. So after the election, students, particularly at Georgetown, were trying to understand what happened along some of the racial and economic lines in the election. I think that that's very central. So we will get to that, and that'll be sort of the end point of where I'll begin. But let me begin by telling you about this edited volume, The Psychic Hold of Slavery, that my colleague Salika Colbert and I, and another one of our colleagues who's not at Georgetown, Aida Levy Hassan, what we set out to do. So when we set out to put this volume together, which includes scholars from a variety of institutions, we wanted to think about how slavery still keeps manifesting itself in American society, so that the vestiges of slavery remain. And we wanted to think about why across cultural media, so be it music, drama, film, literature, why in those areas were Black artists in particular returning to slavery, or as I stated in my chapter on 12 Years a Slave, why does slavery keep returning to those artists? And we had two questions that we thought were very important in our thinking. And so one of the questions was, why can't Black people get over slavery? And it's a provocative question because the question raises more questions. So one of those questions being, how does one quote unquote get over slavery? So what does getting over, moving beyond slavery actually mean, right? Does it mean acting as though it does not exist? No, that's definitely not it. Does it mean thinking about its legacies as it moves from slavery to Jim Crow and how those ideas materially and symbolically are still very much a part of the American cultural fabric? We do think that that's the case. We think the artists also are making those claims. And so part of the issue that we're pushing back there on is, number one, slavery actually probably cannot be quote unquote gotten over, right? The next point that I think that we're trying to make and think about is, or not trying to make, and not trying to think about, something we know, what we're trying to advance in our argument, is that slavery is not a Black people's problem. Racism is not a Black people's problem, and neither is the legacy of either, right? And so it's not about Black people getting over slavery. Slavery is an American problem that is built on anti-Black racism that is embedded throughout American institutions, of which slavery was one manifestation, right? And so the idea here is that slavery is one enactment of anti-Black racism, but it's certainly not the sum total of anti-Black racism. So we really wanted to drive that point home. And then the second question is, even if Black people could get over slavery, why would they want to, right? So this is not solely, this is not a exercise in suggesting that there's value in holding on to the past or the degree to which history may repeat itself, which we can make some clear historical markers of how there are incidents happening right now that are repeating historical events. And part of that has to do with an inadequate dealing with the historical narrative. So it was these two questions that we really, really wanted to take up. We want to use them as an entry point to have a contemporary discussion about how slavery continues to matter, how its legacies continue to matter, and then link those to Jim Crow. Now, why the arts and the humanities? Well, we think that in order to sort of remake the world for whatever that might look like, we have to sort of look at the power of the imagination. And we also wanted to, from an academic point of thinking, unsettle, or not unsettle, but we wanted to add to the conversation that has been predominated by maybe the social sciences, right? And so there's ways that we know that economists, for example, can go back and chart how certain companies profited off of slavery's labor, even if after making that chart, they can't figure out what reparation may look like, or right? And so there's interesting points that we want to have this conversation. But we want to draw those histories, we want to draw those ideas about Blackness and Black people up because we thought that it was central to the moment. So you say, how Professor Patterson is central to the moment? So when Darren Wilson was giving his testimony about Michael Brown, he said that Michael Brown, he described him as an animal, his language, not mine, seemed like an animal coming toward him, even though we know Michael Brown was actually retreating, right? So part of we're thinking about, what is it about the criminalization of Blackness that slavery and Reconstruction made possible and reinforced that continues in the present moment? When Sandra Bland was murdered by the Texas officer Brian Encinia, he said something to the effect that, "I'm gonna light you up." And perhaps he meant, or perhaps he admittedly would just say that he meant he would tase her, right? But any scholar of history, any student of history who knows about Black people's relationship to the law and lynching, right? This type of language, it may conjure different images that seem to be very much a part of the American lexicon. So we use those entry points of contemporary issues to sort of think back through these historical moments. So there's 2 points I'm going to make about that volume that are relevant, and then I'm going to transition into this discussion of the more contemporary period of the 60s and the 70s. But by way of 12 Years a Slave, for those of you who have seen the movie, part of what I think that it helps us to think about is how, in the contemporary moment and historically, Black people's behaviors have been used to explain and or justify the inequities and inequalities that they experience, right? So what are you saying, Patterson? So in 12 Years a Slave, part of what's interesting about that movie, and is part of the point, is that Solomon Northup is, quote unquote, doing what he's supposed to be doing, right? He is, he's making his own money. He is then duped by 2 white men who basically invite him to Washington, D.C., and in essence sell him into slavery. I think that this is an important point because the system of slavery is not a respecter of a Black person who's doing what she is supposed to be doing and one who's not. You're automatically criminalized under the system of slavery. And at the end of the movie, he doesn't, quote unquote, get freedom. He's returned to his family, right? He's returned like chattel. And the point here is that as long as slavery exists, no Black person's freedom is guaranteed. And so what I talk about a little bit in that essay and kind of make the case for is part of what the movie does is it draws attention to the historical ways that these contemporary explanations of inequality that focus on Black people's behavior have always historically missed the mark, right? They always have historically missed the mark, and that anti-Black racism, which, to be clear, and I'll elaborate that on shortly, is a form of racism that is specifically targeted towards Black people, which it could be across the diaspora. But we'll come back. We'll come back to that. But in any case, that is actually that's fairly important, because even if someone, for example, poor Solomon, he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, and he ended up in slavery, and that's part of what the outrage is. I think that's actually part of the point, is that even if he's doing what he's supposed to be doing and still can end up enslaved, it's not about his behavior. And I think that that's something that's very important, because when we go into the contemporary period, particularly in light of civil rights, when we look at some of the conversations that have been happening around people who I call consciousness raisers, not necessarily protesters. I don't have a problem with terminology protesters, but what I do have a problem with is how they're portrayed. And I think that is why I like to say consciousness raisers, because that is precisely what they're doing, and they've had some impacts that may be longer term. But part of what you will have a conversation about is not about, for example, I call him the Minneapolis officer, not about his behavior, but you have conversations, for example, about, oh, well, Floyd had this potential counterfeit $20 bill, and then other people will try to uncover other behaviors, right, that have nothing to do with the matter at hand. They are what I like to call, in one of the videos I do on race and racism, obfuscation station. This is secondary. This is actually irrelevant to the matter at hand. If you go back to the death of Trayvon Martin, part of what people tried to do immediately afterwards, where they talked about his use of marijuana, they go into these character assassinations that then become justifications for murder, right? And this takes us back to slavery and the lawlessness of Reconstruction that continued to the Jim Crow era and so forth. So if we could come for a moment to the contemporary period, where I'm going to switch gears for a little bit, which is why I actually didn't want to give you my agenda etched in stone, because part of what I think it's actually important to do is to kind of lay out some of these terms and then go back to why they mattered in the 60s and the 70s. So when we talk about racism, when I talk about racism, I am in the school of thinking with Beverly Tatum as an example, the school of thinking with Paula Rothenberg, the school of thinking with critical race theorists and Black feminists who think about racism as being when one group, in this case, when white people, we have to articulate and name that, have systemic power in order to enact their prejudices in order to suppress Black people's ability to thrive and to have their material needs met, right? So thriving is even a higher level, but to, at minimum, have their material needs met. And that they're able to do this through the social and political mechanisms that are a normal part of everyday living in society. And so that argument, I think, is very important because a lot of times when people think of racism, they make a couple different moves. They remove the power that needs to be systemic to then suggest everybody can be a racist, right? So it's this sleight of hand where if everybody can be a racist, then that diminishes my individual ability to enact racism. Now, while racism is systemic and often finds itself in institutions, it needs actors within those institutions in order to make it stick. Okay? And so part of what my thinking and teaching and writing and the scholars I'm in conversation with is we take the focus off of, we don't deny its significance, but we take the focus of racism off of individuals, so solely focused on people who engage in intentional, conscious actions that are overt. So that someone calling me out of my name, so you all know the name I'm saying, but not saying, someone calling me that is an example of racism, and that's an isolated example, right? And so the idea becomes, this is not the case. So you say, well, where is this playing out, Patterson? I'm glad you asked. You have people overhead of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli et al. Making comments that, oh, this police officer, first of all, they question whether or not race was involved in George Floyd's murder, number one. But even if it is, they'll say, this is not the culture of policing. This is a bad apple, right? So that in this case, the individual behavior is disentangled from a system that makes it possible. But remember, I said the criminalization of Blackness has happened throughout history. When we talk about systemic and we talk about institutions, institutions can range from, representations that emerge in the media, not the media necessarily like CNN, but sort of in cartoons, and how Black people predominantly and widespread are represented or excluded, because the exclusion matters here, right? So if you only see Black people as criminals, if you only see them in certain contexts, and they're treated as being an anomaly or an exception in other contexts, not only are you, reinforcing the normalcy of whiteness, it's also reinforcing the aberration of Blackness, right? And it is in those spots that the unconscious racism is able to really grow and cultivate, right? So an example that I use in a previous conversation about this is if we go back to Park Amy, right? When she calls the police, as I say in that example, or I've said previously in this example, she doesn't say, you know, in X, Y, and Z. She doesn't have to do that. What she has to do is call on a history in which Black men are assumed to be criminal, are assumed to be violent. There's a racial, gendered, and sexualized dynamic here as a white woman, the Black male rapist. This is coming out of Reconstruction. And all she has to do is conjure up those images and know that they have a certain level of, I like to call, cultural currency with the police to perhaps get a certain type of response. So she doesn't have to explicitly say, something that's presumed to be racist. But what she's showing, perhaps, in addition to maybe unconscious racism, that may not have been that unconscious, is that there's an understanding of the racial codes and what they mean and signify. And people don't like to be called racist. They don't like to be called out on their racism, although I wish they more adamantly didn't like engaging in racist behavior versus being called that, because that is what it's at stake. So when you think about systemic racism, you're thinking about these images that over time have become unconsciously embedded as to who is the norm and who is not the norm, as an example there. When you say, so that's one example when you think about cultural and representation. When we think about other forms of systemic racism, we'll use housing, we'll use employment, and we can use education as three quick examples to make this, to kind of make this point. So we think about in housing. So one of the main ways that communities and individuals have been able historically to generate wealth and to transfer wealth between generations is through housing, okay? The federal government, through the FHA, which was at one point the Federal Housing Authority and then administration and so forth, they denied Black people access to mortgages. As one example, they failed during the 60s and 70s to stop institutions that they knew were either selling people houses that should have been condemned, or they were not enforcing covenants that were discriminatory, or they were not enforcing, they were not doing the enforcement job, and they were allowing subdivisions or communities that had covenants that prevented the selling of a house to a Black person. They let that happen too. And so what happens here is that these narratives about, people having access to opportunities and being equal access to equal opportunities are not true. And the government had a specific role in facilitating these policies that were explicitly racist and also not enforcing policies and practices whose consequence was racial inequity. Now, you take the housing example and you directly connect this to schools, right? Because schools are funded oftentimes based on tax revenue that is generated by housing. In the 70s, the federal government helped to suburbanize by pushing tax money into suburban communities, disrupting cities by putting highways through them, and then limiting transportation options. And so what basically happens is you get an elevated tax base in suburbs, a depressed tax base in inner cities, where you have predominantly Black people and other economically disenfranchised people living. So don't worry, y'all. I'm about to bring it on home for you in terms of where these connections are going. This is important because it is in the 70s that you see this big shift from those intentional, conscious, overt acts of racism into the enactments of them in these institutional, covert, perhaps unintentional, and perhaps subconscious ways. And the irony here is this is an outpouring or a byproduct of some of the civil rights legislation, which we know the Civil Rights Acts banned explicit discrimination. And so what happens in the 1970s is that you get this perversion of Dr. King's idea of color blindness to basically say we should not account for color or race in any specific way. Well, what's the problem with that? There's several problems with that. First of all, the legislative achievements of the civil rights movement always wanted a package deal. Dr. King himself said that a country that had done something special against the Negro should do something special for the Negro, his language, terminology, direct quote. So that's one thing. So there's this expectation that following the legislative achievements of the civil rights movement, we would have more affirmative actions, specific behaviors that are racially targeted towards creating equity and equality. But the exact opposite happens. And so now, in these colorblind moments, you get the failure to talk about race, the failure to talk about the specific ways that race is still being enacted, the erosion of civil rights by moving to race neutrality, when in reality, that race neutrality was specifically about keeping white supremacy intact in these institutions, in these covert ways. And so you say, well, what helps you to say that? And the wonderful documentary by Ava DuVernay entitled 13, she interviews people from the Nixon administration who admit that when they use code words, because they could not say "and" in other words, they would use code words like inner city, urban, they would use busing. They would use that as an entry point to stoke racial animus, because there was a sentiment that after the civil rights movement, or after the civil rights victories, the legislative ones of the 60s, that equality had been created, right? That there's no sense of the historical legacies, which is why I started where I did, on the cycle of slavery and its material consequences, that those legacies still had material consequences, right? That those legacies matter. So as a sidebar, but it's important, Jim Crow segregation in the South had implications in the North, right? Because there was de facto segregation, even if that wasn't the case. And then and those residential possibilities determined where people lived and not lived, where they worked, did not work, what schools they could and could not go to, and that those early choices had long-term consequences. And so the other 2 points here are, number one, this rise of anti-civil rights feelings feeds into this notion of Black people now have choices that they did not have, but all choices are not created equally. Equality of access does not mean equality of outcome, particularly when that just wasn't true. Black people did not necessarily have immediately equality of access. And even if we had equality of access, if my starting point is 2 and your starting point is 7, and we're trying to get to 10, clearly there's an advantage that you have, and you got that advantage because of the cumulative effects of the history of anti-Black racism that resulted in white privilege. But we don't have those conversations because in the 70s, we're talking about meritocracy, so that one's own abilities, hard work, and doings are the primary, if not sole, determinant of that success, right? So this is one thing that happens, which is problematic. But this is critical, and I'm gonna I think wrap up with this and then move towards some of the question and answers. It is in the 70s that the militarization of the police at the local level begins to take on its face. And that this happens as a direct consequence of the social consciousness raising that got civil rights legislation passed. And the idea of law and order was to suppress Black dissent about the ways that the legislative achievements of the civil rights movement had made some possibilities for Black people available, but that had a long way to go in achieving equity. When the current administration calls forth law and order and Nixonian politics, this is not happenstance. this is a point to demonstrate that racial unrest, quote unquote unrest, or that this raising attention to the improper, violent, and murderous behavior of the state and police officers would not be tolerated. But it's also an important moment where, by militarizing the police, the federal government took money that it had been devoting to education, that it had been devoting to Job Corps programs that you would find in communities, and they shifted that towards the police. And so instead of, for example, as crack and cocaine were taking over inner cities for a variety of reasons, instead of, for example, setting up hospitals and investing in hospitals and community centers and rehab, they invested in the police. And so you can see how these historical parallels are worth knowing because they are re-emerging, and they are re-emerging in the same forms. They're talking about people's behaviors. They're talking about, race not mattering, when we know that race is a driving, if not motivating, factor. And so it's a hard thing to lay out. I do think that anti-Black racism persists. I think that anti-racist behaviors are definitely possible, but I don't think that they are possible without having these type of difficult conversations about the histories, without people accepting the fact that although they themselves did not necessarily build the structures on which they received privileges, that they did benefit from them. And so the discussion now is, what actions do you want to take in your spheres of influence in order to diminish how your privilege disadvantages other people? Because one of the things I teach in class and they read is that people, in a sum total game, people's privileges are carved out of other people's disadvantages. And then finally, if we're thinking about capitalism as our economic system, which is what it is, then we have to think about, when we talk about equality and equity, what precisely are we getting at? Because capitalism works through and only by exploiting people. And I think that that's a hard thing to think about. That's a hard thing to think about too. So I know I have said a lot. I have tried to, I want to give you a little preview. I want to weave this and weave that. I think now would be a good time to turn attention to some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was powerful. That was extremely powerful. And I think we needed to be able to hear from the scholarship the historical context of slavery and its connections to the criminalization of Blackness, as we think about it historically, but also as we think about it around these more contemporary issues that are related to systemic racism. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. And we've got a wonderful group of participants here, nearly 400. So we're not able to do the raised hand. And so we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. And so we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So if you have questions, please add it to the Q&A. But I want to start a question from where you sort of led into as it pertains to the police reform, because there are a number of questions that have come up either prior to the webinar and also in the Q&A that are related to that. And I'm going to read this one came prior to.
Okay.
And it says, regarding the next steps of reforming the police departments, some argue for measures that increase accountability and education, such as ensuring body cameras are on and more rigorous racial bias training should be taken. And others argue that it would be more effective to reinvest money away from police departments to other social and community services. And so you started talking about that.
Right.
So what do you think are the appropriate next steps?
Okay, I'm gonna try to rapid fire, and so we get more. So I, as a side note, in the race and racism class, I have the students read the Justice Department's report on Ferguson and Baltimore City, and they have to pick one of the recommendations and then lay out the steps towards alleviating it. And a lot of it often goes about this consciousness, this what do they call it? The bias training. So I think a couple of things. I think it's important that whenever people in this webinar too are engaging in this conversation about the funding of the police, that they know that history, which is why I brought it up, because the police, what people are actually talking about in that saying this, is they're saying you reallocate your budgets in a way that restores some of these functions that over the last 20, 30 years have constantly been cut from locales' budgets in order to provide the opportunities that residents in those communities could benefit from to be productive, and that may also have a diminishing on the crime, because the issue is that crime oftentimes is about opportunity, it's about poverty, it's about all these other factors that money could help to tend to. So I do think that the reallocation of funding makes a lot of sense, and I quite frankly wish that that is the terminology that people would use, because although there are some places that I think are talking about perhaps completely defunding police, I don't think that from what I've been reading, that is slightly what they mean. I think what they mostly mean is reallocating. I think people should look at Newark, I believe, is a place where the city council scrapped the police a couple of years ago. And so people have talked about to what degree that's been effective. They have people, though, who perform some of those functions. They just don't call them police. And so there needs to be some imagining about what functions are critical, what needs to occur, who can provide that service. But there's certain, the police get a lot of equipment that they actually should not have as far as being not in the war. And second of all, I think that body cameras are important, but you got to have them on. There are too many cases where people don't turn them on, so they're not effective if you don't have them on. Increase accountability for if you don't turn them on. In addition to the anti-bias training, I'm saying the wrong thing. Implicit bias, that's what it's called. But I call it explicit implicit bias because it's usually not implicit. Those tests, not as a one-time training. That's what I think part of the problem with some of this is that training has to be ongoing. Diversity, implicit bias is not a one-time drop-in. It is a culture that has to be instilled in this case. I think perhaps more interaction in certain of the communities in which people police, perhaps living in those communities. So I think there's some different types of models. Part of the issue here, though, is that people just don't see Black people as being humans. And that then creates a window for how they treat them. And so perhaps living with people, understanding them to be people, would contribute to it as well. I do also think that firing an overhaul of police system and firing racist police officers would be a very helpful start too.
Thank you. So I'm scrolling, and you talked about the dehumanization. And so there's a question that I want to continue that picks up on that, but as it pertains to Black women. Mm-hmm. So with the death of Tolan Salu, how do you feel the dehumanization and disregard of Black women has contributed to the upholding of white supremacy?
Right. So part of what, right. So this is such an interesting moment because just for historical record. So Black Lives Matter. When Black Lives Matter formed, the three women, two of whom publicly identify as being Black queer women, the three women set up a large system that was about criminal justice, but that also focused on the general dehumanization of Blackness across these institutions. And part of what happened in that process was that when you start seeing who was on TV, it were men who came late in the game, but who sort of served as these Black men who were spokespeople or what have you. So I would use this example to say that the vestiges of patriarchy and Black patriarchy and Black heteropatriarchy are wide, and that they contribute to white racism by one, white supremacy, and anti-Black racism by privileging Black men's narratives of encounters with the police that result in their death, while diminishing Black women's is, and in that context, position this divide and conquer within Black communities, when in reality, what is good to see is when we have this more robust discussion about all the Black deaths that are happening and why it's important to have those conversations and recognizing what scholar Kathy Cohen calls cross-cutting issues, which are sometimes competing and conflicting issues within the community. But if if we need to get what we need to get, which is toward freedom, then the patriarchal, the heteronormativity, the transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, all of that has to be diminished in these conversations, because that is obfuscation station. That is not those type of issues should not be used to sort of divide the collective objectives. And that's kind of what I think white supremacy wants to happen. And all these identities are co-constituted through each other. I think it's always important to keep that in mind too.
Great. So I want to continue that thread about all lives matter, right?
Yeah.
So because here's a question from a student, because there are people who, have this different narrative, and
Right.
and they like, it's all lives matter. So how the question is, how would you respond to a person saying all lives matter to make them understand the importance and purpose of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Absolutely. So I think I would a couple of points there. So the first point is that, in a not tongue-in-cheeky way, but that is the point that Black Lives Matter is trying to make. The point that Black Lives Matter is trying to make is that all lives don't matter, and that Black lives do in fact matter, right? And so I think it's an important point to make, because it sort of unsettles them, because they think you're saying the same thing, and we're not saying the same thing. What we're saying is that when Black lives matter, we'll be closer toward all lives mattering. And the problem with all lives matter is that it is denying the fact that Black lives have not mattered in the way that white lives have mattered. And you're reinforcing the same, at least epistemological violence, that the phrase is trying to undo. So if your point is to, depending on and for the students who ask this and people want to know this, depending on your relationship with the person, if your point is to suggest all lives should matter, well, then you should be saying that Black lives matter, because that's the point Black Lives Matter is making. But historically, the weight of history matters here, and those phrases mean something different. And Black Lives Matter as a phrase is trying to make that point, whereas all lives matter would be going back to the point that Black lives matter only in their surplus value in white supremacy.
Very good. Very good. So I want to, because you're a doctoral scholar, you're a role model. We want to also sort of get into some questions about, how you navigate academia, and because you're talking about very, important topics here, which some of your colleagues might disagree with you or have a very strong opinion against it. And so I do want to ask this question of that a student shared. Have you had any confrontation or indifference with a colleague of yours regarding your work? And if yes, how do you handle it? And what advice could you give us if we find ourselves in a situation like this?
So right now I'm in a unique position, because I am in an African American Studies department where all the faculty, we have similar intellectual interests. We are similarly positioned in terms of subject positions. And so I think that's unique. But I'll go back, I don't have to go back too far, because I was in two different English departments prior to being in this African American Studies department. And so again, back to the point I was making about racism. Most of these points, when they were manifesting themselves about my work, it wasn't ever about, we just think Black studies broadly is not worth examining, because that's probably what was at the crux of it. But it's like, I don't know about this. I don't know about the focus. Is this if it's Black, it's too narrow. It doesn't have universal claims and all kind of other issues that, we shouldn't necessarily take seriously. So I would say I'll give you a couple of points. One is seek, the Leadership Alliance is a great place to do this, mentors and advisors whose work is simpatico with yours, right? Because they can give you that kind of in field read or whatnot, what have you. I also think it's good as a strategy to kind of engage what the critic is saying, because you might need to harness that information going down the line, which is to say, my experience has been one person will come to you with a department or a broader concern that may not be the broader concern, right? So it's like we think, but it's really one or two people. The second thing I would say is so you've gotten that criticism. The third thing is to kind of reach out, fill out other voices in that unit, right? So if you're a graduate student, get other professors' opinions, kind of just in a discreet way, secure information. And the fourth thing I would say is to always document. Always document, I call these Comey memos. Take your real-time notes of just what happened. Just this has happened, got to even have this conversation, because it may be useful. But the main thing I would say is that remember you are part of a broader professional community of scholars that are not confined to wherever your current institution is. I tell people to think about professional tenure versus or professional standards, because it may not be tenure, whatever the case, but profession versus the institution they're at, which is to say, position oneself if possible so that you're in the best situation to leave or make a different move or choice if you have to. But really think about the networks. Being a part of this leadership alliance is, this is 19 years later and we're having this conversation. And if COVID had not been here, I perhaps would have met some of you at the end of July. So I say that to say, think about the resources that you do have. And if you think you're having a biased experience, it probably is. Don't second guess that. But I do think there are politics of navigation that, may make sense. I was joking earlier when I said, I'm just so conflict adverse. That's actually not true. And so I don't seek it, but I've had conversations with department chairs just where I know that, in the most academic language, she was trying to play me. And I do think that it was racial, part of it was age. For you young doctoral scholars who are going right through, this is going to be another issue. People are not going to expect you to walk in the room as Dr. Fill in the blank, who's still in his or her or their 20s. They're not going to expect that. And so that creates a whole nother set of environment.
Great advice. I think I'm on mute. Okay. So I want to get to a question about some of your scholarship on reparations before we leave here. And so one question is, what steps can students take to hold their universities accountable for reparations and for being actively anti-racist?
Right.
It can be intimidating as an undergraduate to demand that your institution take responsibility for its actions.
Right.
So they'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this matter.
So two things. So I think when I think about reparations, I think about reparations in the context that, I've talked about in the news and we've talked about in a lot of different venues. And then I think of reparations as reparation in terms of different modes of repair to communities. And I am a proponent that this has to involve financial, this is not just a monument, this is not just an apology, which are important, but this is financial and, investments as well. As students, what I have learned in my faculty experience is that students sometimes hold and wield more power than they sometimes believe, particularly when they get in a group and they put all of the resources they have available. So you say, well, what resources do you have available? Well, you all Snapchat, you tweet, you go on the Facebook, like an older person say, you on Facebook, you have student newspapers. You're in a moment where institutions care about how they're viewed in a broader public. So I would not lose sight of the fact that you're in a moment where institutions care about how they look in a broader public, and sort of think about that. So think about the what is it that you want that acknowledges, right, these past, and then what is it that they could specifically do to get these futures? So at a place like Georgetown, which people think of in some respects as being, more progressive than other institutions on some of these issues, it was student activism that had turned the needle. We had been talking about a Department of African American Studies, or at least before department, a major in African American Studies, well before we got that. But after the students went and had a sit-in in the president's office in light of what happened at Mizzou with the football team. I mean, in 2015 fall, there were a lot of issues going on in the world, which will be very similar to the fall of 2020, that, shifted the needle in the temperature on some of these issues. So I would do that. I would try to find faculty that are similarly interested and that are positioned with some type of institutional power, because that makes a difference too. So I will say, in terms of being savvy, part of my fight started as an assistant professor. They went on as associate professor, and there's fights as a full professor, and those look different. They're different. But I wasn't ever one of those people like, oh, I'm worried about, tenure. My feeling was always like, well, I can find another job. Wherever it might be, because at some point, not because I was that's not an arrogance, but that's sort of, I want to make sure that's not like, oh, I'm so good I can find another job. That's not what I was thinking. What I was thinking was, there are lines that are going to be drawn in the sand. And if those lines are crossed, then I might have to make a different decision then. And that's what I meant by that. So I always felt like, this work was important. And the work I've done in African American Studies, if it were ever important, it is now. So it's just a fascinating moment to be.
That's awesome. Okay, in 1 minute, can you give students advice about how they can best engage in the movement that's going on now, and how they can really make sure through the protest conversations? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, listen, every you don't have to do everything. Let me first say that you don't have to do everything, and everything is not for everyone, right? So some people want to go to the protest, some people don't. Some people have reasons they can't go, right? And so we shouldn't take exception to that. What I would encourage you to do is think about what what you are willing and able to do, and what your platforms are. So you might decide, for 2 weeks, I'm going to highlight some of these under the radar incidences or instances of police brutality, because that's something I want to spotlight. You might decide you're going to read White Fragility, and you're going to tweet things from there or put it on Snapchat to do this. You might decide that you're going to encourage people in your family to complete the census. You're going to talk to your undergraduate colleagues, and you're going to say, I understand that Joe Biden may not, make you want to do cartwheels at the ballot, but this election is not about Joe Biden. This is about the future that you and people you care about might want to have, because there's going to be long-term consequences. And it's not about Joe Biden as an example. It's about who's the attorney general. It's about who's over the education. Who's the education? It's over who's at HUD. You say you care about civil rights. You might want to care about whether there's somebody at HUD who's making it easier to discriminate against people who are in poverty and have housing insecurities. So use that platform, I think, to think about how to educate, how to engage, to make some of the points. Remember that you are a student, who may be pursuing doctoral education, and that education can also be a platform for you to do some of these other things that you want to do. But I do think that is the way. So I said to say, don't be out protesting and getting an F, because then those things are not, we don't want those things to be the case. But I do think of yourself, institutions have to change, but think of yourself as being able to make some incremental changes, even if it's individuals who at some point may be at these institutions, and then take care of yourselves and stay well, which is to say, I have to say, oh, I'm not looking at the news tonight. So I think it's helpful to remove oneself, replenish, and be ready to go back into the fight.
Thank you so much, Robert. This has been an amazing conversation,
Well, thank
and we are so fortunate. We know that the BBC World News had you, MSNBC, Business Insider, and so we can say that we have you as one of our scholars to be able to help us really think through these really important, very difficult issues during, a time when we are overwhelmed with everything that's going on and trying to make sense of it all. And you really helped us to do that.
Well, thank you, thank you. Sorry I can answer more of your questions, but at least hopefully the thinking is helping you. And if any, I tell you all the time that if I do a video from his office and it allows you not to have to explain something to somebody, I'm happy for that too.
Yeah, and we'll continue to share your videos that you're doing because they are extremely informative. But to everyone who has joined us this evening, thank you for your participation. And we look forward to continuing this conversation on the Conversations with a Doctoral Scholar and on our Professional Development online program. Everyone have a good evening.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Robert.
You're welcome. Good night.